smug about our UU perspective on Christmas that we overlook the real meaning of the holiday and the real force it has been in Western culture for all these centuries. And actually, we UUs have had a considerable contribution to make to the celebration of Christmas as we know it. And this morning, I want to present a couple of simple truths to witness. E told us a lovely story about Christmas trees, and many people maintain that it is a German custom, and indeed Prince Albert popularized the custom in England when he and Queen Victoria had a tree in 1840. Going back in time a little, it became an institution practiced by Christians when Martin Luther put a tree in his home for his children. Clement Miles writes in Christmas Customs and Traditions that after wandering one Christmas Eve under the clear winter sky lit by 1,000 stars, Martin Luther set up for his children a tree with countless candles, an image of the starry heaven whence Christ came down. But even though we hear of the much earlier pagan and Roman use of evergreens during the winter, there is also an ancient connection in Christianity to trees. Many folks had the tradition of putting the cherry or hawthorn tree into water to blossom at Christmas time. And in England, there is a legend of Joseph of Arimathea, who is said to have traveled to Glastonbury after leaving the Holy Land, and he planted his staff there, and it blossomed every Christmas Eve. Some of you may have heard of the Unitarian minister who is the father of American Christmas trees. According to a UU World article by Chris Wilcox, in 1832, the Reverend Charles Follin and his wife Eliza delighted party guests with something quite remarkable, a Christmas tree. Now, Follin was German-born. He settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and became Harvard's first instructor in German. And he was an abolitionist and a fervent advocate of religious freedom. Wilcox writes, the German tradition of Christmas trees had been seeded in the United States before that famed evening in the Follin's parlor, but the sight of a tree indoors, festooned with decorations, was still captivatingly new. The Follin's tree was nudged into history with the help of their friend Harriet Martineau, who wrote about it in the popular women's magazine. Martineau could hardly find enough adjectives to describe the tree's loveliness, and the children, she reported, were speechless, all eyes wide open, all steps arrested. The Fallen Church Society in Lexington, Massachusetts, is a UU congregation that to this day, in part, keeps alive its connection to its former minister through its annual Christmas tree sale. Wilcox says that each tree the congregation sells bears a tag telling the buyer about the lineage of fallen Christmas trees and the remarkable man with whom they are associated. The second story we heard about today, the birth of Jesus in a manger in Bethlehem, may contain truths much more difficult to trace and details much harder to substantiate. But Carl Seeberg, the Unitarian Universalist who compiled a 1983 anthology celebrating Christmas, declared that those who come to Christmas from a liberal religious tradition have more to celebrate than those approaching it from any single limited perspective. We join this ancient festival, he claims, with full appreciation for its deep roots in the human psyche. And the fact that we celebrate Christmas in UU churches shows how much more like Universalists than Unitarians we are, because the theological legacy of the latter can be traced to Puritans who denounced Christmas as a wanton bacchanalian feast. And it was forbidden at one time by Parliament under Cromwell in England. In New England, the first pilgrims worked on Christmas Day as on any other day. And in the early 1800s, the Congregationalists, who we are descended from, ignored Christmas. Maybe Dickens' Ebenezer Scrooge was a Unitarian. Bah, humbug. Some of us resist saying there is truth in the story of Christmas. Seberg points out that today we find miracles an obstacle to our acceptance of a story. But in the ancient world before the birth of science, the reverse was true. Jesus is described in the Gospels as being of the lineage of King David, from which the legendary Jewish Messiah would be born. And so the choice and logic of Bethlehem was due to that desire to link Jesus to this destiny. The details added on to the story, likewise, were meant to impress non-believers, not only Jews, but Greeks, whose heroes were supernaturally born. Still, for all the imputed sense of majesty and mystery amidst the squalor and ordinariness of the manger, there is a deeper and simpler message that we UUs often miss because of our long-standing aversion to the supernatural. And we would agree with the words of Thomas Jefferson when he explained why he cut up the Gospels to make his own Bible, that the biographers of Jesus had laid a groundwork of vulgar ignorance, of things impossible, of superstitions, fanaticisms, and fabrications. The deeper message of the manger is the incarnation. This is a term that refers to the act of the divine coming to dwell among humanity, that God would act to bring heaven to earth through the life of Jesus, known as the Christ. Carl Seberg calls the Christ aspect of the incarnation a spirit or influence personified over and over again in human form, an influence to save humanity from lower levels of being and raise it higher. The exclusive Christian interpretation is that this happened with Jesus only. But Seberg lifts up the broader tradition, which sees this as the spirit of all who are helpers or friends of humanity. And here, let me put in a word for humanism. Because originally the term humanism was used to designate the celebration of the humanities, those pursuits and disciplines that are most characteristic of human enterprise. Kevin Bowder writes that the humanities were thought to be valuable because they were humane, because they reflected the genuine humanity of those who pursued them. In this sense, humanism is nothing but a settled appreciation of the value and dignity of humans. He goes on to say that of all people, Christians ought to be the most robust humanists. Why? Because the humanities derive their value from humanity, from human nature. And humanity is very valuable and very dignified indeed. The inestimable value of humankind and human nature is underlined by nothing less than the incarnation of Jesus Christ. To affirm the enfleshment of the God-man, Kevin Bowder says, is to affirm the value of humanity. As a Catholic for many decades, for me, the Catholic view of creation and incarnation meant that any true humanism is at least implicitly religious in character, and a humanism marked by Jesus's humanity. I believe, as Professor Glenn Ambrose describes it, that Jesus reveals a particular way of being human that is especially attentive to the injustice, misery, suffering, and oppression that is a reality in our world. And his life was lived by example, not doctrine. Thus, a Christian humanism would seem to be shaped, as Ambrose says, by its commitment to follow Jesus in his concern for the marginalized and the oppressed. This reminds me of the German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who challenges us to rethink how we see the story of the birth in the manger. That is, from the start, an identification of the divine with the least of these as lived out in the short time span of Jesus. And he wrote, "Who among us will celebrate Christmas correctly? Whoever finally lays down all power, all honor, all reputation, all vanity, all arrogance, all individualism beside the manger. Whoever remains lowly and lets God alone be high, whoever looks at the child in the manger and sees the glory of God precisely in his lowliness." But of course, Christians aren't the only ones to see the example of Jesus as a revelation of what we humans can be. Vance Morgan points out that in his Divinity School address, Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson suggests that we should consider Jesus in a new way. Emerson wrote, "Alone in history, Jesus estimated the greatness of man. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man and ever goes forth anew to take possession of his world. He said, 'I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, God speaks. Would you see God, see me, or see yourself?' He was the only soul in history who has appreciated the worth of man." Morgan suggests that during this Advent season, as we await the incarnation anew, we would do well to remember, in the midst of daily reminders of how deeply into apathy, depravity, and evil human beings are capable of descending, that we are also the recipients of divine love, a love of which in some inexplicable way we are worthy. This should make a difference in how we think and act about ourselves and each other. Marilyn Robinson, the author of Home and Gilead, puts it this way: "So let us say Christ entered the world as essential truth, cosmic truth mediated to us in a form presumably most accessible to us, a human presence, a human life. That he should have done so is an absolute statement of our value, which we have always done so much to obscure. It is possible to claim a dignity for humankind that is assured because it is bestowed on us, that is, because it is even beyond our formidable powers to besmirch and destroy. Human beings," she writes, "are sacred things, whom it is indeed blasphemy to wrong. Only think what we are, then why God might have a fondness for us." There are a number of UUs here in this congregation for whom their faith broadens out, not cancels out, the Christmas message of love. Our Universalist faith emphasizes that message to us. We are enough. We are loved just as we are. Love is that divine spark within us. And not only that, but we are uniquely placed to spread that love in this world, the only world we know. And we are reminded by Howard Thurman that this work is what we can all vow to do after the celebration of Christmas is past. This is his simple truth. When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the king and princess are home, when the shepherds are back with their flocks, the work of Christmas begins to find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among the people, to make music in the heart. May we be the ones to make it so. Blessed be. Amen. Our closing hymn is number 226, People Look East. Please rise in body or spirit. time is near, autumn rounding of the year. Make your house fair as you are able, trim the hearth and set the table. People of peace, love the guest is on the way. Birds be glad the earth is bare, one more seed is planted there. Give up your strength, the seed to nourish, that in course the flower may flourish. People of peace, sing today, love the roses on the way. Stars keep watch when night is dim, one more light the whole shall brim, shining beyond the frosty weather, bright as sun and moon together. People of peace, love the star is on the way. Thank you. Please be seated and hold on to your hymnals. Hold on to your hymnals.
Every time someone says that, I get nervous.